Long before the name Akkad was carved in stone, long before kings called themselves gods and armies marched at the edge of the known world, there was only silence. Not the silence of emptiness, but the hush of beginnings, when rivers first bent around cities of mudbrick, and men raised walls not just to guard grain, but to hold memory. In that silence, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates, what later scribes would call Mesopotamia, nurtured something old and deep. Not yet an empire. Not yet Akkad. But the soil already held stories. The Sumerians were the first to shape this cradle of civilization. They came before writing had taken form, before kings could trace lineage on clay tablets. In places like Uruk, Ur, and Lagash, they raised temples to their gods, stacked like stairways into heaven. They built canals, carved seals, and sang of Enlil, Inanna, and the endless turning of fate. It was a land of city-states, each ruled by its own Lugal, or king, each guarded by its own deity. Sometimes they traded, sometimes they fought. Always they watched the skies. They believed the gods set their fates in stars and storms. But even as these cities grew, crowded with merchants, priests, and craftsmen, something else stirred in the north. There, near the bend of the Euphrates, the people spoke a different tongue. Akkadian. Unlike the Sumerians, they came from Semitic stock. Herdsmen, traders, wanderers from the deserts beyond. At first, they served the Sumerians, took jobs as cupbearers, gardeners, or mercenaries. They learned the customs, spoke the words, honored the temples. But they kept their own tongue and their own gods. And slowly, something began to shift. A new pattern emerged. Sumerian kings began marrying Akkadian wives. Akkadian merchants controlled vital trade routes reaching toward the Levant and beyond. In city after city, the balance between Sumer and Akkad, between the old and the new, began to tilt. It is from this quiet turn in the tide that the story of Sargon begins. No one knew then what shape the future would take. No one guessed that one day, a man from these borderlands would carve the first empire into the face of the world. That he would call himself King of the Four Quarters, and that his name would echo for centuries beyond his death. Yet before that rise, before battles and palaces, before edicts and rebellion, there was this, a soft shifting in the soil of history. A moment when old cities dreamed and new voices stirred. This is where our tale begins, not with a battle cry, but with a whisper. A whisper that grew into legend. A whisper that would one day become Akkad. Long after his death, the scribes called him Sargon the Great. Arukin, they wrote in clay, the true king. But he was not born a king, nor a nobleman, nor even free. His beginnings were quiet, humble, and wrapped in myth. In the tradition of later kings, stories were crafted to elevate his birth. And so, like many great figures remembered by civilizations, his origin was draped in mystery and divine omen. The tale told by scribes centuries after his reign begins not in a palace, but in secrecy. My mother was a priestess, the inscription reads, my father I did not know. My kin ruled no land. My city was Azupiranu, which is on the banks of the Euphrates. Azupirinu, the city of saffron, was no mighty capital. It was likely a small, nondescript town lost to time, somewhere near the river's flow. A place where water carried both life and danger, and where reeds whispered to the wind. Sargon's mother, said to be a high priestess, was bound by ritual chastity. To bear a child was a breach, a secret that could bring death. And so, she placed her infant son in a basket woven of reeds, sealed it with bitumen, and cast it upon the river. Like a prayer or a burden, the river, in its ancient rhythm, carried the child downstream. This image, the infant floating alone through the brown waters, the banks lined with wild barley and papyrus, lingered in Mesopotamian memory for generations. He was found, the story goes, by a gardener. Akki was his name, a servant of the royal court. He took the boy from the water, raised him as his own, and taught him the ways of the earth, how to dig canals, tend orchards, feel the shift of seasons in the soil. Thus, the boy who would become ruler of the world began his life in mud and silence, beneath the eyes of gods who watched unseen. He grew strong, observant, restless. In time, he rose to serve at the royal court of Kish, not as a prince or warrior, but as a cupbearer to the king. Yet the role was no mere servant's post. In Mesopotamian courts, the cupbearer stood close to the ruler, heard the whispers of power, and learned its taste. There, at the elbow of kingship, the young Sargon began to dream. The Sumerians saw time as a wheel, ever turning. Cities rose and fell. Fortune shifted like sand. But now, something unusual stirred in that turning. Something not seen before. A man with no noble name, no ancient lineage, would seize a crown. Not as a steward for gods or cities, but by his own will. And all of it, empire, war, legend, began with a child in a basket, floating quietly down the river. In the shadowed lanes of Kish, a boy of no title moved among men who shaped cities. The house of Akki, the gardener, was not grand. It smelled of earth and river rushes, and its walls bore the marks of smoke and labor. Yet within it, Sargon learned the rhythms of a world built not on marble but on toil. He rose before the sun, felt the cool breath of the dawn, and worked among fields watered by narrow canals. Under Akki's guidance, he learned how to coax fruit from stubborn soil and how to watch the sky for signs of flood or drought. But it was not just the land he studied. He listened when elders spoke at the fire. He watched when tax collectors visited from the palace. He noticed how words could shape men's fates more than blades. He saw that power did not only dwell in temples or sit upon thrones. It moved, softly, among those who knew how to hear it. As he came of age, his sharpness was seen by others. One day, the call came at a place in the palace of Kish. Not as nobleman or warrior, but as a cupbearer to the king, Yorzababa. To some, it was a lowly station. To Sargon, it was the first true step into the halls of power. The cupbearer did not simply serve drink. He stood near the king at every feast, every council, every rite. He was trusted. He heard secrets, observed alliances. He learned the scent of fear behind a noble smile. And perhaps more importantly, he watched the king, his triumphs, his hesitations, his flaws. Yorzababa was a ruler caught between glory and decline. Kish had once stood tall, its banners respected by city-states from Lagash to Uruk. But now, rivals pressed from all sides. Enemies gathered beyond the rivers. Trade faltered. The gods, some whispered, had grown restless. And amid it all, Sargon listened. He listened as Yorzababa consulted his priests, hoping for divine favor. He listened to generals boast of loyalty even as they hid their discontent. He saw how kingship, once thought ordained by the gods, now trembled in mortal hands. Legends later claimed that Yorzababa feared Sargon. That dreams plagued the king, visions of his cupbearer bathed in blood, holding a scepter not given, but taken. Whether such visions were real or written after, one truth remains: Sargon's presence unsettled the old order. There is a moment in history, difficult to trace, when a man ceases to be a subject and begins to think like a ruler. For Sargon, it was here, in the echoing halls of Kish, beneath stone tablets and painted ceilings, that the seed of empire was first planted. He was not noble. He had no army. He bore no title. But he watched. And he waited. Ambition, once born, does not sleep easily. It stirs in quiet moments, at dawn, as the city wakes. It whispers in the silence of corridors, where decisions are made in the hush before words are spoken aloud. In Kish, Sargon bore the king's cup with a steady hand, but in his mind, he held visions far heavier than wine. He had seen the court, studied its workings, and grasped something few dared name: the throne was not invincible. Kings could falter. Cities could fall. The gods, though worshipped, did not always intervene. The old ways were changing. Across Sumer, the great city-states jostled for dominance. Lagash and Umma fought bitterly over canals and fertile plains. Uruk watched them both, wary and proud. And in each city, temples rose like mountains, their ziggurats reaching skyward to draw favor from the heavens. But beneath this splendor, the land trembled with unrest. It was not just war, it was weariness. Too many kings, too many gods, too many debts owed in barley and blood. The people needed order, not ritual. Bread, not blessings. A stronger hand to bind the fractured land. Sargon felt this need deep within. It was not merely power he sought. It was direction. Unity. A new name carved above all others. But ambition, like any force, draws resistance. Yorzababa, whether by dream or doubt, sensed the rising fire in his cupbearer. Legends tell of a test, a cruel riddle from the king. He sent Sargon to the temple of Ishtar in Uruk, bearing a sealed tablet, its message hidden from the bearer himself. Within, it said, "Kill the boy." But the goddess had her own will. As the tale goes, Ishtar favored Sargon. Whether through divine warning or human sympathy, the high priestess in Uruk defied the order. Sargon lived. The message, meant to end his rise, only confirmed what he already knew: there would be no crown handed to him. If he were to rule, it would be through his own strength. And so he turned not to kings, but to soldiers. Mercenaries, outcasts, men who had no city but sought coin and cause. He gathered them slowly, quietly. Not in rebellion, yet, but in readiness. Then came the fracture. Uruk, mighty and ancient, moved against Kish. War broke like summer flood. Sargon, at the center of it all, did not flee. He took command. And when the smoke cleared, Kish lay broken. Sargon was no longer the servant. He was now a warlord, a commander, and soon, something more. Ambition, long held in silence, now spoke through action. The world would never again look upon him as a man of low birth. He was rising. And with him, the first threads of empire. The fall of Kish was not a loud collapse. It came not with horns, but with quiet surrenders, crumbling oaths, and the fading voice of a king who could no longer command loyalty. When Sargon took the city, he did not claim it by right of birth. He claimed it by merit, by steel, and by the trembling silence of those who once ruled. The court, stripped of its power, did not rise against him. The people, worn by fear, by taxes, by famine, saw in him something new, not just a conqueror, but a breaker of old chains. From the dust of Kish, Sargon looked south. Uruk awaited. Uruk was not just a city. It was legend. The city of Gilgamesh, of high walls and sacred scribes. It was one of the oldest centers of Sumerian power, with temples that reached toward the sky and traditions older than memory. It was proud, holy, and fierce. But it, too, had grown weary. The rivalries between city-states had drained it. Its armies had marched against Kish and failed. Now Sargon came not as a supplicant or emissary, but as a force. The campaign was swift. Sargon's forces, hardened and loyal, were not bound by city loyalty or priestly command. They followed a man, not a god. His strategy was precise. He struck at supply routes, isolated strongholds, and exploited divisions among the Uruk elite. Uruk, for all its history, could not withstand the momentum. When the gates finally opened, perhaps by negotiation, perhaps by fear, Sargon entered not as a destroyer, but as a reformer. He did not sack the temples. He did not kill the priests. Instead, he honored the city's gods and affirmed its traditions, but under a new order, his own. From here, the great shift began. No longer were these city-states isolated powers, constantly at odds. Sargon began to weave them into something larger, binding them not just by tribute but by administration. He left governors, ensi, loyal to him. He set scribes to record grain and silver. He reinforced temples, but ensured they bowed first to the throne. It was a delicate balance, to respect the gods of each city while placing his own seal above theirs. And above all, he claimed a new title, Lugal of Kish, king in the old tradition. But he was more than that now. His vision was no longer a single city's glory, but a vast dominion. To the people of Sumer, this was unprecedented. No man had ever united so much land under a single rule. The cities watched and yielded. Your Lagash, Nipper, they too would fall or submit in turn. But it was in Kish and Uruk, those ancient hearts of Sumerian pride, that the world first changed. Sargon stood at their center not as a usurper, but as the beginning of something unseen before. Empire. With the cities of Sumer beneath his banner and the riverland subdued, Sargon turned not to rest, but to creation. He would need a seat worthy of his rule, not inherited, but born of his own will. A city not tangled in ancient loyalties or divided by temple factions, but new, unholy his. Thus, he founded Akkad. Akkad, in the old tongue. A name that would echo for centuries and yet, today, remains unseen, its walls buried beneath layers of time, its exact place still lost to earth. No stone has yet declared, "Here stood Akkad." And yet, in the minds of his people, in the records of scribes, and in the fears of enemies, it was real. As real as any temple, any throne, any law. He built it in the north, not far from Kish, along the curve of the great Euphrates. It was a strategic choice. From here, Sargon could watch the southern cities while reaching toward new lands in the north and west. It was a crossroads, a place where merchants, armies, and emissaries would converge. Akkad was not simply a capital. It was a symbol. In its heart stood the palace, not a simple residence, but the axis of administration. Around it stretched markets, storehouses, workshops, and, above all, archives. Clay tablets by the thousands would be created here, tracking the pulse of empire, grain, labor, tribute, conquest. Akkad was to be a machine, governed not just by kingship, but by order. Its walls, though unseen today, were once watched by guards trained in foreign tongues. Its streets echoed with the voices of distant lands. Gold from Anatolia, timber from Lebanon, lapis lazuli from far-off Afghanistan, all flowed toward Akkad, drawn by the gravity of its power. And at its heart, Sargon reigned. He was no longer simply Lugal, king. He took on the titles of conqueror and steward of the gods. His rule, he declared, was not by birthright, but by divine favor. Ishtar, the goddess of war and love, stood behind him. Her temples in Akkad rose with splendor, her priests sang of Sargon's victories. And here, too, began the spread of Akkadian language, not just spoken in courts, but etched into tablets, replacing Sumerian in the scripts of record and ritual. Akkad was not just a city. It was the first heartbeat of empire. From it, messengers rode swift across dusty roads. Governors were appointed. Laws were issued. Tributes calculated. The land that once belonged to many now moved to the rhythm of one. Yet for all its might, Akkad was humble in one way: it left no visible ruin. No ruins, yet 1,000 shadows. In that lies its mystery. And its greatness. Beneath the blade and the crown, beneath the glory of conquest and the swelling hymns to Ishtar, there stood another pillar of Sargon's empire, silent, tireless, and unseen. It was bureaucracy. To hold an empire together, stone could not suffice. Nor could fear. Roads could carry armies, yes, but also grain, messages, and law. Without the steady hand of scribes, the empire would drift like sand through unclosed fingers. And so, in Akkad and beyond, Sargon built not just walls but systems. The record keepers, the Dub-Sar, became the lifeblood of his reign. Bent over clay tablets, they shaped cuneiform with styluses of reed. Each wedge, each line, marked something real. How many measures of barley came from Lagash, how many oxen were sent to the temple at Nippur, how much copper flowed from the mines of Magan. Every event was measured. Every field, counted. Every year, named. For in Akkadian tradition, years were not marked by numbers, but by deeds. A tablet would not read year 5 of Sargon, but the year Sargon destroyed Uruk, or the year Sargon washed his weapons in the sea. These titles preserved memory and shaped identity. They turned time itself into a tapestry of victory. Weights and measures, once varied from city to city, were now standardized. A shekel in Akkad weighed the same as one in Ur. A gur of grain was the same in every ledger. This was not simply convenience, it was control. Trade could now be taxed fairly. Labor could be counted. Soldiers could be fed. From Gersu to Sitpar, from Mari to Susa, the tablets multiplied. No matter the dialect or local god, the scribes wrote in Akkadian. A unifying language, stamped in clay. Recent findings, unearthed in the city of Gersu, reveal the astonishing complexity of this system. Thousands of tablets, carefully stored, detailing rations, construction, and daily governance. Not proclamations of war or glory, but the ordinary pulse of rule. The math of empire. And Sargon understood this. For all his victories, it was not the sword alone that sustained his power. It was order. He did not merely conquer, he counted. He catalogued. He controlled. His realm was not held by fear, but by knowledge. And so, the great paradox of Akkad emerged, the first empire in history, built not just on ambition, but on administration. Clay tablets, small and fragile, carried the weight of nations. And long after walls have crumbled and kings been forgotten, these tablets remain. Silent witnesses to a world where empire was first imagined and recorded. In the gentle hush that follows conquest, the empire's pulse is measured not in the clash of swords, but in the quiet movement of grain, metal, and words across dusty roads. Under Sargon's vision, the Akkadian realm awakened to its rhythm, not only from its heart, the unseen capital of Akkad, but through the arteries that stretched across deserts, mountains, and rivers. The roads themselves became lifelines. Where once paths diverged, now firm trade routes linked field to fortress, temple to outpost. Stability, once elusive, found footing. The empire's stability spurred the construction of roads, improved irrigation, and a wider sphere of influence in trade, a network vital to both economic health and imperial coherence. These routes were not merely passages, but conduits of connection, threading through all corners of the realm. To the west, the cedars of Lebanon, tall and fragrant, were more than timber. They were the bones of palaces, the struts of ships, and the scent of distant forests woven into the halls of Akkadian rule. To the east, across the formidable lands of Elam lay untold riches, metals, minerals, and secrets waiting beneath its highlands. Sargon's campaigns there secured not just territory, but links to those key resources. Trade did not stop at those borders. Silver from the distant highlands of Anatolia, perhaps the silver mountain of legend, found its way to Akkad. Precious blue lapis lazuli, mined in the rugged lands of Afghanistan, traveled this network. Copper, vital and malleable, came by sea from Magan, in today's Oman. Trade extended from those northern highlands to the southern deserts of Arabia, and even beyond. Beyond raw materials, this web connected even further. Merchants traversed to the Indus Valley, trading in exotic goods and exotic tongues, creating a thread of exchange from Mesopotamia to South Asia like no other. The system thrived across land and sea. Road networks cradled caravans of textiles and grains. Ports welcomed ships from Magan, Tilmun, Bahrain and the Persian Gulf, and Maluha, the Indus region, weaving import and export into a living tapestry. Under this system, trade was not peripheral, it was the empire's bloodstream. Goods flowed into Akkad, messages flowed out. Administrators in distant provinces recorded cargoes, taxed caravans, and kept the pulse of economy steady. And so, the empire grew not merely through conquest, but through connection. In the ancient world, power was not secure by arms alone. A king might conquer cities, command soldiers, and build roads across continents, but without the gods, his throne rested on sand. Sargon understood this deeply. He was not born into a divine line. He had no ancestral claim to rule. His strength came from action, not blood. And so, to bind his reign in the minds of his people, he looked to the heavens. There, he found Ishtar. Ishtar, Inanna to the Sumerians, was the goddess of love, war, fertility, and kingship. She was not a tame deity, nor distant. She was fierce, unpredictable, radiant with beauty, and bathed in blood. Where she walked, empires rose and fell. Sargon declared that it was Ishtar who had chosen him. The bond between them became legend. In texts etched into clay, he speaks of her walking beside him in battle, lifting his arms, driving fear into his enemies. Ishtar, who loves me, he wrote, gave me the upper hand in battle. But this was more than devotion. It was politics wrapped in myth. By claiming the goddess's favor, Sargon legitimized his rule. He bypassed the old city gods of Sumer, Enlil of Nippur, Enki of Eridu, and placed Ishtar above them all as the divine patron of the empire. In doing so, he reshaped the religious map of Mesopotamia. In Akkad, her temple rose tall. Its priests and priestesses, often drawn from the elite, served not only in ritual, but in politics. Among them stood one figure above all, Enheduanna, Sargon's daughter. He appointed her high priestess of the moon god Nanna in a bold move. In sending her south, into the heart of Sumer, Sargon fused two realms, the northern power of Akkad with the sacred institutions of Sumer. Enheduanna, both priestess and poet, composed hymns to Ishtar that still echo today, the oldest known writings attributed to an individual. In them, Ishtar is exalted not just as a divine figure, but as a reflection of empire, powerful, radiant, terrifying. Thus, religion and rulership became one. To oppose Sargon was not merely to defy a man, but to resist the will of heaven. And so, in the minds of the people, the victories of Akkad were not merely military, they were ordained. The enemy fell because Ishtar withdrew her favor. The land obeyed because she blessed its king. In this divine narrative, Sargon did not just rule. He reigned with the stars behind him. Empires, like great rivers, do not rest. Even as Sargon aged, his realm demanded motion, laws enforced, revolts silenced, borders watched. And though his own strength would fade, he sought to extend his will beyond death, through sons molded by power and war. Two names rose after him, Rimush and Manishtushu. Rimush, the younger son, took the throne first. His path was not crowned in peace. Though Sargon had subdued the land, many cities waited, restless, for the founder's passing. When he died, rebellion followed like wind behind a broken dam. Sumer rose in revolt. Ur, Umma, Lagash, all once bowed beneath Akkadian rule, now challenged it. The old loyalties frayed. The southern cities remembered their gods, their kings, their pride. Rimush answered with iron. He led campaigns not as a diplomat, but as a hammer. One by one, the rebels fell. His inscriptions, brief and austere, tell of crushed cities and seized plunder. He spoke less than his father. There were no flowing tributes to the gods, no poetic boasts, only record, who rose, who fell, what spoils returned to Akkad. From Elam in the east to Mari in the west, Rimush restored what had unraveled. But the price was steep. Repression fed discontent. And though the records speak of his triumphs, his end was sudden and suspicious. Some say he was murdered by his own courtiers. If so, the wheel of empire turned again, this time to his brother. Manishtushu, older and more deliberate, claimed the throne after Rimush's fall. His reign echoed his father's in ambition, but his gaze turned outward. He launched naval expeditions southward into the Persian Gulf, reaching the lands of Tilmun and Magan, present-day Bahrain and Oman. His forces crossed the sea in search of copper and control. Trade routes were strengthened, distant ports brought under imperial reach. Inscriptions from his reign show both military conquests and administrative rigor. He focused on temple endowments, land grants, and infrastructure. A ruler with an eye toward legacy, not just dominion. Yet even Manishtushu met a violent end, assassinated, like his brother, perhaps by rivals who saw weakness or ambition beyond measure. Their fates remind us, to inherit an empire is not to possess it. The land Sargon had forged, wide and restless, could not be held by name alone. His sons bore his blood, his seal, his sword. But not his legend. Still, through their rule, the empire endured. Bruised, but unbroken. Awaiting the one who would bear Sargon's fire once more. By the time the second generation of Akkadian kings had taken the throne, the empire no longer sat quietly in Mesopotamia's cradle. It reached outward, across sands and seas, over mountains and marshes, like a hand unfurling to grasp the edges of the known world. This expansion was no mere boast. It was real. And it was vast. To the west, Sargon's armies and emissaries pressed into the Levant. The records speak of his conquests reaching the upper sea, likely the Mediterranean, and cities as distant as Muri and Ebla. These were not backwaters, but rich centers of trade and writing, with cultures as proud as any in Sumer. Yet the Akkadians came with the authority of empire, and with them, the Akkadian language and law began to seep into foreign courts. In the north, beyond the lush plains and river valleys, rose the Anatolian highlands. There lay that silver mountain, a phrase repeated in royal inscriptions. Whether it was mythic or real, it symbolized the great wealth of metals that drew Akkadian interest. Through war or diplomacy, Sargon's influence reached these regions, tying mountain tribes into his economic web. To the east, the Zagros Mountains, rugged and untamed, formed a natural barrier. But barriers, to Sargon and his heirs, were invitations. Here lay Elam and the lands of the Gushans, peoples fierce and independent. Rimush and Manishtushu waged campaigns in this region, not only to pacify rebellion, but to keep open the highland routes vital for tin, silver, and timber. And to the south, beyond the twin rivers, stretched the sea. Magan and Tilmun, names echoed in Akkadian records, lay across the Persian Gulf. Today we know these places as Oman and Bahrain, ports that once sent copper and incense to feed Mesopotamian temples and forges. Manishtushu's naval expedition secured these distant coasts, ensuring the empire's wealth flowed not only from conquered land, but from maritime trade. This vast web of territory was not ruled by sword alone. The empire managed it through appointed governors, standardized systems, and the careful placement of loyal officials. Tribute was extracted, yes, but local rulers were often kept in place under Akkadian oversight. This method, pragmatic and flexible, allowed the empire to breathe across cultures. For the first time in human history, a single political entity had stretched from the Taurus Mountains to the Arabian Sea, from the western deserts to the eastern highlands. The sun rose and set over lands that knew the name of Akkad. Yet for all this expanse, the seams were delicate. The empire's strength lay not only in conquest, but in balance between temple and crown, tribute and tolerance, center and frontier. For now, that balance held. But even as it did, the cracks had begun to form. To the outside world, the Akkadian Empire was glory and dominion, a realm of marching armies, mighty kings, and divine sanction. But for most who lived beneath its gaze, empire was something quieter. Something practical. It was felt not on the battlefield, but in the rhythm of daily life. In the marketplaces of Ur and Adab, in the fields of Umma, in the fishing villages along the Tigris, people rose with the sun and lived by the structures Sargon had set in motion. Taxes were the empire's lifeblood. They came not in coins, coinage did not yet exist, but in kind, grain, oil, wool, cattle. A farmer in Lagash would record his harvest, knowing a share would go to the temple storehouses, then onward to Akkadian administrators. Artisans paid in textiles or metalwork. Shepherds were taxed in sheep. Everything, from barley to bitumen, had a value. This system required not only strength but precision. Here the scribes, the dub sar, played their silent role. They sat in dim rooms, styluses in hand, pressing wedge-shaped marks into clay. Line by line, they documented the empire, its debts and payments, marriages and lawsuits, temple offerings and labor assignments. They were trained from youth, learning not just the Akkadian language, but also Sumerian, the sacred tongue of tradition. Some tablets read like ledgers, others like commands. One might list the daily rations for workers building a temple wall: 10 men, 30 liters of barley, 3 goats. Another might record a land dispute: the boundary stone was moved. The scribe testifies. The gods are witness. From these tablets, an entire world emerges. The temples remain centers of life, not only religious but economic. They owned land, employed workers, and distributed food. Though Sargon had centralized rule, he understood the temple's power. He left their rituals intact but ensured their loyalty. Priests paid taxes, too. Their offerings were counted and their land surveyed. Even justice bore the empire's imprint. A laborer in a distant village might never see Akkad, but he knew its reach. If wronged, he could appeal to a local governor, an ensi, who reported to the king. Punishments were harsh but recorded. Theft, adultery, fraud, all had consequences written in code and enforced with consistency. For the people of the Akkadian realm, empire was not only a banner, it was a system. A steady hand beneath the chaos of life. They planted in its calendar, prayed in its temples, measured grain in its weights, named years by its kings. And in this quiet order, Akkad endured. Amid the thunder of armies and the grinding weight of empire, one voice rose in song. It did not come from a king, nor from a warrior. It came from a woman, a priestess, a poet. Her name was Enheduanna. She was the daughter of Sargon, placed by him as high priestess of the moon god Nanna in the sacred city of Ur. But she was not merely a symbol of royal favor. She was a bridge between old and new, between divine and human, between Akkad and Sumer. To make his empire last, Sargon needed more than governors and soldiers. He needed legitimacy. The Sumerians, proud of their gods and traditions, would not easily bow to a northern conqueror. So he did something subtle: he gave them a daughter. Enheduanna, though Akkadian by blood, embraced the role of Intu, high priestess of Ur. She performed the rituals. She led the festivals. She walked the steps of the ziggurat with reverence. And yet, she did something no one before her had done. She wrote. In clay and breath, she composed hymns, poems to Inanna, to Nanna, to the great gods of Sumer. But they were not mere praises. They were personal, powerful, and lyrical. In them, she wove sorrow and triumph, longing and devotion. She did not just describe the gods, she spoke to them. Lady of all powers, I have entered your holy shrine. I, Enheduanna, exalt you. Her words survive today as the earliest known writing attributed to a named individual. Not king, not scribe, but a woman, writing in her own voice, in her own time. And her influence was more than literary. Her hymns became models for temple liturgy. They were copied by scribes for centuries, shaping Mesopotamian theology and poetic form. Through her, Inanna's cult grew stronger, more personal, more central to the imperial faith. But her life was not untouched by danger. In one of her poems, she speaks of exile, cast out from the temple, stripped of power. She prays for justice, pleads for restoration. And in time, it came. She returned to her post, her authority reaffirmed. Her resilience became legend. Enheduanna was more than a priestess, more than a poet. She was the spiritual architect of Akkadian rule, a voice that gave the gods human feeling and the empire divine breath. In her, the ancient and the new found harmony. And through her, the soul of Akkad was sung. When Sargon's sons passed into dust, one by murder, the other by ambition, the empire looked for new strength. What it found was not merely a successor, but a storm. His name was Naram-Sin. Grandson of Sargon, heir to blood and crown, Naram-Sin did not inherit peace. His reign began in flame. The land once united had begun to fracture. Rebellion stirred in the south. The Gushans raided from the mountains. Old cities, wearied by taxes and foreign governors, sensed weakness. The spell of Sargon's charisma had faded, and the people questioned whether the divine favor still lingered over Akkad. But Naram-Sin did not hesitate. He met the chaos with iron. Campaign after campaign crushed the uprisings. He marched against Kish, against Ur, against Elam. The stele of his victories, carved in stone, shows him taller than men, wearing the horned crown of a god, something no Akkadian king had dared before. He declared himself king of the four quarters of the world. It was not humility, but vision. He saw not a fractured Sumer, not a loose confederation of vassals, but a single, unified empire, stretched to the edges of the earth as he knew it. And he ruled not just as a sovereign, but as divine. The horned crown was no small claim. In Mesopotamian tradition, it was worn only by the gods. To place it on a human brow was to step beyond mortal bounds. Many were scandalized. But Naram-Sin was undeterred. He said the gods had chosen him. To some, this was blasphemy. To others, destiny. In stone reliefs, he climbs a mountain toward victory, enemies beneath his feet, stars watching above. His soldiers are orderly, disciplined, and his foes, like the Lulubi of the Zagros, are shown in flight or supplication. He did not just defeat his enemies. He immortalized their defeat. Under Naram-Sin, the empire reached its zenith. Trade flourished. Roads were maintained. New temples rose. The name of Akkad echoed from the Levantine coast to the Elamite plateau. But this golden height held within it the seeds of something darker. For when a man calls himself God, the weight of failure becomes heavier. And the gods, though silent, remember. To rise above kings was one thing. To rise above the gods, that was another. Naram-Sin had conquered. He had unified. He had ruled as no man before him. Yet the very height he reached brought with it an ancient danger, hubris. Among the people, murmurs grew. whispers in temple courtyards, in quiet halls where priests read omens in sheep's livers and cloud patterns. They asked, could a man truly wear the horned crown and not draw divine ire? The signs, they believed, began to appear. Storms that came out of season. Crops that failed. Rivers that refused their banks. Enemies that rose from places long subdued. And then the Gushans. From the eastern mountains they came, rough and unpredictable, not a unified army but waves of tribes. They struck not with ceremony, but with fire. Their raids disrupted trade, sacked cities, and scattered Akkadian garrisons. Unlike the organized armies of Sumer, the Gushans moved like wind, fierce and fleeting. Naram-Sin responded with fury. He marched against them, as he had so many others. He fortified cities, restored temples, and demanded loyalty. Yet something had shifted. The people did not rise with him as they had with Sargon. The priests grew cautious. The gods, once invoked to crown his wars, now seemed distant. Then came the omen that would scar Akkadian memory for centuries. Naram-Sin, in a desperate campaign, sacked the city of Nippur. Nippur, the sacred city of Enlil, king of the gods. It was not an act of conquest but of punishment. The priests there had questioned his divinity, resisted his rule. In rage, or perhaps fear, he sent his soldiers to tear down the temple, seize the offerings, and silence the opposition. It was a fatal mistake. In Mesopotamian thought, to defy Enlil was to shatter the order of the world. The gods were not sentimental. They upheld balance. When that balance broke, retribution followed. The empire began to shake. Famine struck. Cities rebelled. The Gushans pressed harder. And though Naram-Sin fought until his final days, the divine favor he once claimed seemed to slip from his grasp. Later generations would remember him not only as a mighty king, but as a warning. A caution whispered in the curse of Akkad, a lament written after his fall. He made the city of Akkad a corpse. Because he defied the god Enlil, Enlil destroyed his city. But was it truly the gods? Or was it the slow decay that touches every empire, when power forgets its limits? Pride has many voices. Naram-Sin listened to his. And the world, once beneath his feet, began to rise against him. Even as divine anger was whispered in temple courts and the Gushans descended from their mountain fastness, the empire did not fall in a single blow. It staggered, yes, but it did not yet collapse. Naram-Sin, though aging, remained a force, and the machinery of empire still turned. The revolts were widespread. Cities in the south, Uruk, Umma, and even parts of Ur, rose in open defiance. Governors once loyal declared independence. Some did so out of desperation, others out of opportunity. The aura of invincibility had faded. The roads grew less safe. Trade slowed. Temple grain stores, once full, began to run dry. But Akkad was not merely a palace or a name. It was a system. And systems, when resilient, can withstand great stress. Naram-Sin did not retreat into silence. He sent messages to far provinces, reaffirmed alliances, reinforced garrisons. Where he could, he negotiated. Where he could not, he punished. His armies marched again, not in the glory of expansion, but in the grind of preservation. In Elam, he reasserted control with fire. In the north, along the upper Tigris, his generals built new outposts to shield the heartland. Even in the face of mounting difficulty, he continued building and restoring temples, hoping perhaps to mend the broken bond with the divine. And in many places, his efforts held. The empire did not simply crumble at the first sign of unrest. Its roots ran deep, in language, law, administration. Cities still used Akkadian seals. Scribes still copied hymns in the royal script. Farmers still measured fields by Akkadian standards. Even rebellious governors often continued imperial practices. They resisted the crown, but not the system it had created. This was the paradox of empire. Even when its rulers faltered, its structures endured. But each success was more fragile than the last. The cost of quelling revolt rose. The loyalty of cities grew conditional. The Gushans, though still disorganized, continued to exploit the chaos, striking when least expected. In time, the wars shifted from reclamation to attrition. Victory no longer meant expansion, but survival. Naram Sin died, eventually, not in defeat, but in exhaustion, having spent his final years holding together a world he had once ruled with ease. The empire he left was cracked, yet not broken. It still breathed. And for a time, under his successors, it would struggle to rise again. For even in twilight, Akkad remembered its dawn. In the valleys of Sumer, a king was more than a man. He was the axis of the world, the chosen vessel of the gods. His role was not merely to govern, but to uphold the very order of creation, what the Mesopotamians called me, the divine laws that shaped life. And among those kings, one title rose above all others. King of the four quarters of the world. It was not Sargon who first claimed it. It was his grandson, Naram Sin, who dared to inscribe those words on stone and seal, to place himself not only above his enemies, but beside the gods. The four quarters referred to the known world, north, south, east, west. To claim mastery over them was to speak to total dominion, not just over lands, but over peoples, languages, even time itself. And to wear the horned crown, the headdress reserved for deities, was to make the claim complete. Naram Sin was not simply the son of a king. He was a god-king. But what did it mean, this divine kingship? To his people, it brought both awe and anxiety. For in ancient Mesopotamia, the gods were not benign. They were fierce, contradictory, often cruel. To be like them was to bear both favor and burden. Naram Sin's rule was shaped by this identity. His monuments showed him towering over enemies, scaling mountains, receiving homage not as ruler, but as something more. No Akkadian king before him had ever dared this. It was a departure from tradition, a shift in the very structure of rule. Yet this divine status did not exempt him from duty. On the contrary, it deepened it. A god-king was expected to succeed, always. To falter was not merely a failure of policy, but a cosmic imbalance. Thus, every drought, every rebellion, every raid from the hills became a judgment. And when Naram Sin faced such trials, the burden of divinity grew heavy. In later years, priests and poets would question the wisdom of his claim. The Curse of Akkad, a lament written after his reign, speaks of Enlil's wrath, of divine order shattered, of cities turned to dust. Whether these words reflect the truth or the bitterness of later generations, they endure as testimony to the risks of placing a man among the stars. Yet for a time, the title held. Naram Sin's successors, his son Shah Kalishari among them, continued to use it. The idea of divine kingship had taken root. Later empires, from the Assyrians to the Persians, would echo it in their own way. The king was not only ruler, he was the embodiment of empire itself. In Akkad, the man became myth. The crown became halo. And the world would never again see kingship in quite the same way. In the quiet soil of Gursu, far from the thunder of battle or the high proclamations of kings, the empire revealed its truest form, not in monuments, but in clay. It was here, among the ruins of an old Sumerian city absorbed into the Akkadian realm, that archaeologists in our time uncovered a remarkable sight: hundreds of clay tablets, each etched with the patient, deliberate marks of scribes long forgotten. The tablets lay in what was once an administrative archive, a modest mudbrick building, now crumbled, but once alive with voices, footsteps, and the scratch of styluses. They did not sing of gods. They did not boast of kings. They recorded, instead, the heartbeat of an empire. Here were lists of livestock, how many sheep had been born, how many died. Here were inventories of beer, grain, copper, and wool. Records of deliveries to temples, rations for workers, wages paid to builders. Every task, every resource, every name had its place. These tablets show us the empire not as a dream or a myth, but as a living machine. Each line tells of a person, a temple sweeper, a stonecutter, a warehouse clerk. One seal impression bears the name of a governor serving directly under Naram Sin, the mighty king who had declared himself divine. His title is clear: your servant. Even the mighty required the mundane. Empire was not sustained by strength alone, it was sustained by record. The scribes of Gursu did not lead armies. They did not wear crowns. Yet their work held the empire together. They standardized weights, tracked taxes, documented property transfers, and made sure that the grain stored in spring was still edible by winter. They worked in both Akkadian and Sumerian, bridging tradition with rule. This was bureaucracy, not as red tape, but as architecture. It was structure, memory, precision. And in these tablets, buried for thousands of years, we see the full reach of Sargon's vision. He had not simply conquered. He had organized. He had not merely ruled, he had measured. Empires fall. Palaces burn. But clay endures. And in the ruins of Gursu, the hum of Akkad still whispers. Gursu was never the capital of the Akkadian Empire. It did not house kings or armies of renown. It lay nestled in the southern heart of Sumer, a place older than Akkad itself, once the seat of the mighty city-state of Lagash. And yet, in the reign of Sargon and his heirs, Gursu became something more profound, at the center of continuity, of administration, of the daily rhythm that made empire breathe. Here, the empire's reach was not marked by banners or blood, but by inkless words pressed into clay. And through those tablets, found buried in archive rooms, fallen among broken bricks, we glimpse not only the machinery of rule, but the lived world of Akkad subjects. From recent excavations, we know Gursu pulsed with activity. Workers and scribes moved in the temple precinct, grain carriers shuffled through courtyards, livestock pens rang with sound. It was not a city of conquest, it was a city of balance, where temple and bureaucracy wove together. The governor in Gursu, appointed by the Akkadian crown, bore a seal with Naram Sin's name, declaring loyalty to the king of the four quarters. Yet his duties were not grand, they were practical. He oversaw the collection of goods, the recording of labor, the settling of disputes. He stood as the empire's shadow, present, patient, and observant. Each tablet unearthed in Gursu is a window into this world. One records the distribution of grain to temple workers, men and women both, measured precisely, perhaps adjusted for age or status. Another documents the movement of silver for a ritual. Others list the quantities of beer for laboris, or the transport of stone for temple repairs. In these details, the grandeur of empire shrinks to human scale. The people of Gursu did not speak of Akkad as myth. They lived it as taxpayers, temple servants, scribes, and farmers. They rose with its calendar, they measured their worth by its standards, they prayed to its gods. But they also endured its burdens. Droughts, decrees, conscriptions, they too were part of the rhythm. And in that rhythm, we find the true shape of Akkad. Not just a kingdom of kings, but a network of cities like Gursu, diligent, dutiful, and enduring. Places where the empire was not dreamt, but done. Where kings sought eternity in stone, Gursu found it in clay. The world of Akkad did not end with the trumpet of an enemy's army or the burning of a palace. It ended with absence. The rain ceased. The rivers, once faithful, betrayed the land. And in their silence, cities that had stood for centuries crumbled into dust. Around the year 2200 BC, the skies over Mesopotamia dimmed. Storms became rare. Canals dried. Crops withered in the fields before they could be harvested. Archaeologists call it the 4.2-kilo-year event, a sudden, fierce climate shift that reshaped empires. Entire regions fell silent, not through war, but through drought. In the north, the city of Tel Leilan collapsed almost overnight. Where once scribes walked and farmers sowed barley, wind now stirred empty streets. Dust layered the ruins, proof not just of time, but of sudden abandonment. And the signs were everywhere. Sediment samples from the Gulf of Oman show a sharp rise in windblown silt, dust lifted from the once verdant plains of Akkad. Stalagmites from Iranian caves reveal a drop in rainfall. Even coral deep beneath the sea bears scars of this drought. The earth had turned away. For an empire built on water, the consequences were devastating. The canals that once carried grain now cracked and curled in the sun. Famine spread. Cities, once loyal, turned inward. Governors no longer sent tribute. Temples, stripped of offerings, fell into disrepair. The great roads of Sargon's time, once bustling with trade, grew quiet. And into that silence came the Gushans. From the eastern highlands, they descended not as an army, but as a tide. Nomadic, loosely organized, but relentless. They found a land already weakened. Their raids, once nuisances, became fatal blows. With each campaign, the fabric of the empire loosened. Naram Sin, once divine in title, found his strength met not by battle, but by disintegration. Later generations would not forget. They shaped a story around the fall, a warning, a lament, a curse. In the Curse of Akkad, a poem written after the collapse, the gods turned their faces away. The great fields yielded no grain, the clouds did not rain. The people, parched and starving, begged to the heavens, but no voice answered. Was it the pride of kings? The wrath of gods? Or simply the wind and sky? Perhaps it was all of these. What is certain is this: the empire that had once claimed the four corners of the world could not master the skies. And so, in the end, it was not war, but the breath of the earth that brought Akkad to its knees. When cities fall, they leave behind ruins. When empires fall, they leave behind stories. Long after Akkad lay broken and its kings forgotten, its memory survived in a tale both poetic and haunting. It was not a chronicle carved for glory, but a lament, a bitter hymn carved in cuneiform and sung by generations who looked back in sorrow. It is known as the Curse of Akkad. The poem, written centuries after the fall, does not blame foreign armies or political intrigue. It does not name the Gushans, or even the drought. Instead, it points to something older and deeper, divine punishment. According to the tale, Naram Sin, in his pride, defied the great god Enlil. When Enlil withheld favor, the king, desperate and angry, sent his army to sack Nippur, the sacred city, the seat of Enlil's temple. It was an act unheard of, a violation of cosmic order. And the gods, once silent, responded. The curse unfolds like a dirge. Enlil brought a flood, a wind. The people's tongues were silenced. The sheepfold was empty, the cattle shed desolate. The storerooms held only dust. It is not history as we measure it, but truth as they felt it. The poem tells of chaos spreading like rot. Cities abandoned, rivers turned to blood, the cries of the people rising unanswered. Naram Sin, stripped of divine favor, wanders the ruins. He prays, sacrifices, weeps, but the gods remain distant. His sin has broken the pact between heaven and earth. And through this lament, the Sumerians framed their world. They did not see empire as eternal. They saw it as conditional, a gift from the gods, withdrawn when balance was lost. Akkad became the cautionary tale, its greatness turned against itself. But the poem is more than judgment. It is memory. It preserves the ache of loss, the confusion of decline, the need to make sense of collapse. The curse of Akkad ensured that the empire would not be forgotten. It was studied in scribal schools, copied on clay by students learning to write. It shaped how later Mesopotamians understood power, piety, and fate. And so, though its walls crumbled and its kings died, Akkad lived on, not in triumph, but in mourning. Sometimes, it is in the lament that the soul of a people is most clearly heard. The empire of Akkad had vanished. Its roads lay broken, its scribes silent, its kings replaced by others who ruled without its grandeur. And yet, in the generations that followed, Akkad did not fade. It transformed. No longer a living power, it became a legend, a name spoken not with fear, but with awe. Children in temple schools learned the names of Sargon and Naram Sin. Priests invoked their victories. Scribes copied their tales. Even in cities once conquered by them, people remembered their might not as tyranny, but as golden history. This was no accident. It was the work of story. In Mesopotamia, history was not just fact. It was teaching. Each tale carried a warning or a hope. And Akkad, though fallen, offered both. Sargon's story became the model of kingship. His humble birth, his rise from cupbearer to king, his founding of the empire, it was a path many rulers sought to imitate. Later kings would claim descent from him, or say they ruled in his tradition. Naram Sin, once condemned, was remembered too. Not just as the one who defied the gods, but as the one who built temples, crushed enemies, and claimed the world. His stele, showing him climbing a mountain, crowned as a god, was unearthed centuries later and copied by new kings who wished to mirror his strength. Even the empire's fall became part of its myth. The drought, the Gushans, the curse of the gods, all were told again and again. But each time, the story gained new meaning. To one age, it was a tale of pride punished. To another, it was the memory of a time when order once ruled the land. Through story, Akkad was never truly lost. Its memory traveled on clay tablets, sealed in jars, buried in temple libraries. In cities like Babylon and Nineveh, rulers built their own empires in the shadow of Akkad's legend. They unearthed its writings, studied its grammar, revived its laws. And so, what the sword could not preserve, the word did. Empires fall. But stories, when told again and again, can endure far longer than kings. They cross centuries like rivers, shaping the minds of those who come after. And in that quiet endurance, Akkad lived on. Centuries passed. The dust of Akkad settled. New kings rose, of yore, of Babylon, of distant cities yet unborn when Sargon walked the earth. Yet even then, the name of Akkad lingered in the stones. Not as a warning now, but as a promise. And in the land of Assyria, the past stirred once more. In the 8th century BC, some 1,500 years after Sargon of Akkad, the Assyrian king Sargon II ascended the throne. He was not born of legend. He carved his name into history by choice. He chose the name Sargon not by inheritance, but by invocation. By claiming it, he tied himself to the mythic founder of empire, the ruler who had once conquered the 3/4 of the world. In doing so, Sargon II positioned his own rule not as new, but as a rebirth, a continuation of a tradition so old it had become sacred. This was no hollow gesture. The Neo-Assyrian Empire would become the most expansive and powerful Mesopotamian empire the world had seen. It adopted not only Akkad's ambition, but its administrative precision, its reverence for record, its belief in kingly destiny shaped by divine will. Sargon II built a capital, Jisharukin, fortress of Sargon, with wide roads, towering walls, and carved panels depicting his conquests. Like his namesake, he claimed victories far and wide, from the Zagros Mountains to the Mediterranean. His scribes, priests, and generals all echoed the old rhythm: order, tribute, fear, and glory. In his inscriptions, Sargon II referred to himself in language that mirrored the ancient titles: King of the Universe, Ruler of all nations. Even the old gods, long merged and renamed, returned in his prayers. But perhaps more than conquest, it was legacy he sought. By reviving Sargon's name, he ensured that memory and power would walk together. In the minds of his subjects, the line between the ancient Akkadian and the living Assyrian king blurred. Time collapsed. Empire returned. And so, the legacy of Akkad did not end in ruin. It passed like fire across the centuries, rekindled by those who understood that power alone fades, but myth endures. Sargon II died in battle, and his city was abandoned soon after. Yet his echo remains, a testament to the enduring pull of a name first whispered on the banks of the Euphrates. Of all the ancient capitals that shaped human history, Uruk, Nineveh, Babylon, none carries a deeper silence than Akkad. It was the heart of the world's first empire, the city of Sargon, the center from which laws were sent, armies marched, and the divine kingship of Naram-Sin shone brightest. And yet, unlike the others, Akkad has never been found. Its name is carved in stone, written in clay, remembered in song. But its walls lie buried somewhere still unnamed, its streets unseen, its temples lost to the shifting dust of time. The absence is haunting. For centuries, scholars have searched. Clues linger in tablets and inscriptions. Akkad was near the Euphrates, north of Nippur, possibly near Kish. But the rivers have changed course since Sargon's time. Cities that once stood near each other now lie miles apart, or beneath farmland, or under towns built layer upon layer. Some believe Akkad lies beneath Baghdad itself, hidden by centuries of building and rebuilding. Others point to sites along the Tigris, or the plain west of modern-day Samarra. Many excavations have been proposed, some started, but none have uncovered definitive ruins. There are reasons. Unlike Babylon or Ur, Akkad was built in a time of transition. Its structures may have been less monumental, its stonework reused in later centuries. The chaos following the empire's collapse, especially under Gutian invasions, may have left the city shattered before it could fossilize in memory. And yet, the city lives in the texts. It is mentioned in the lists of kings, in the accounts of trade, in the curses of poets. Other cities called it their overlord. Enemies feared its reach. Governors boasted of serving its kings. Even in absence, Akkad exerts gravity. In modern times, its mystery drives exploration. Archaeologists and historians comb satellite images, review old excavation notes, trace trade routes in ancient archives. They seek a pattern, anything to pull the city from silence. For if Akkad is found, it would be more than a discovery. It would be a moment when myth returns to earth. Until then, it waits, somewhere beneath the soil of Iraq, where the Tigris and Euphrates still run, and the past breathes just below the surface. A capital unseen, but never forgotten. Long after Akkad's kings were dust, their words remained. Akkadian, the language spoken in their courts, carved by their scribes, whispered in their temples, did not vanish with the fall of empire. It endured, adapted, spread. And in its journey, it carried the mark of Akkad into every corner of Mesopotamian life. At its peak, Akkadian was the first Semitic language to become a language of state. Before Sargon, Sumerian ruled the tablets, the priesthood, the songs. After Sargon, Akkadian began to take its place, not to erase Sumerian, but to stand beside it. This duality endured for centuries. In scribal schools, students learned both tongues, Sumerian as the sacred language of tradition, Akkadian as the language of empire, law, and diplomacy. And the script, cuneiform, remained. Akkadian adapted the wedge-shaped signs of Sumerian writing for its own use. Though the sounds were different, the script became shared, a common medium through which nations spoke. For over 1,000 years after Akkad's fall, Babylonian and Assyrian scribes wrote in Akkadian cuneiform, producing texts ranging from royal annals to astronomical records. The religious impact was just as deep. Akkadian hymns, like those of Enheduanna, were preserved and recited in temples long after her voice was stilled. The names of Akkadian gods, Ishtar, Shamash, Marduk, spread through Mesopotamia, some blending with older deities, others gaining new prominence. Naram-Sin's claim of divinity may have faded, but the idea that kings were divinely chosen took root. In governance, the Akkadian model endured. Later empires, Babylonian, Assyrian, even Persian, borrowed its structure, appointed governors, standardized taxation, imperial roads, military garrisons. The idea of ruling vast, multi-ethnic territories from a central bureaucracy began with Akkad. Even the concept of the king of the four quarters, universal rule, was inherited. It became the aspiration of all great Mesopotamian monarchs. In law, too, the Akkadian legacy lived on. Though the famous Code of Hammurabi came centuries later, it was shaped by legal traditions that took form under Akkad: compensation for injury, regulation of trade, protection of property. And beyond Mesopotamia, Akkadian traveled. It became the lingua franca of diplomacy in the Late Bronze Age. Letters between pharaohs and kings of Hatti or Mitanni were written not in Egyptian or Hittite, but in Akkadian. It had become the voice of power. So while the empire fell, its language, religion, and structure did not. They outlived the cities and the kings. They seeped into the soil of civilizations yet unborn. In that way, Akkad never truly ended. It became part of how the ancient world thought, ruled, and prayed. When we think of empires, we often recall kings, wars, cities, and monuments. But beneath the throne, alongside the stone, were the quieter voices, the ones who shaped how memory survives. In Akkad, those voices belonged to the poets, the priests, and the scribes. It was they who recorded victories and defeats. They who composed hymns, treaties, tax ledgers, and myths. Without them, Sargon would be a forgotten soldier. Naram Sin, a nameless conqueror. The empire, a shadow without substance. The scribes were first among them. In temple schools, idubas, young boys trained for years, memorizing signs, copying tablets, learning not just language, but power. For to write was to shape reality. A scribe could create a law, define a border, preserve a prayer. In Akkad, every brick bore a name, every delivery a receipt, every contract a signature impressed in clay. It was through scribes that the language of Akkadian reached its height, spreading into diplomacy, science, and prophecy. They recorded eclipses and omens, droughts and marriages, all in the same steady hand. The priests, too, carried the empire's breath. They were guardians of ritual, interpreters of divine will. In Akkad's temples, they read the livers of sacrificed animals, watched the stars for signs, offered incense and wine to appease the gods. They upheld the bond between heaven and earth, and in doing so, upheld the legitimacy of kingship. In Hedjuana, the high priestess and poet, stood at the meeting point of these roles. Her hymns were theology, literature, and politics woven together. She gave voice to Ishtar's fury and beauty, shaping the goddess in the mind of an empire. Through her words, a woman's voice entered history, not as a whisper, but as a pillar. And the poets, like her, gave form to feeling. They turned conquest into legend, collapse into lament. In the Curse of Akkad, we do not just read of a city's fall, we feel it. The hunger, the silence, the god's absence. The poets ensured that Akkad would not be remembered only for what it built, but for what it lost. Together, these figures gave Akkad a second life. Long after its fall, students copied its texts. Priests recited its prayers. Kings studied its chronicles. And through each line of cuneiform, the past remained alive. Not just through stone, but through story. Time breaks all things. Cities fall. Kings die. Empires crumble. But sometimes, what remains is enough to remind us that these were not myths, but lives. Akkad's physical traces are few, scattered like the bones of a great beast across the soil of Mesopotamia. Yet in each fragment, each stele, each seal, each tablet, we glimpse the shape of what once was. Perhaps the most famous of these remnants is the victory stele of Naram Sin. Carved in pink limestone, towering over 2 meters tall, it shows the king ascending a mountain, trampling his enemies beneath him. He wears the horned crown of divinity. Around him, soldiers climb in disciplined lines, while his foes fall in chaos. It is not a depiction of a battle. It is a statement. This was how Akkad saw itself, divine, ordered, triumphant. The stele was found not in Akkad, but in Susa, far to the east, where it had been taken as war booty by the Elamites centuries later. Even in theft, it was preserved, its image carved by Akkad, its survival ensured by those who once opposed it. Other fragments tell smaller stories. Cylinder seals, no larger than a man's thumb, show kings in prayer, gods in profile, lions in combat. These seals, pressed into wet clay, authenticated messages, contracts, and inventories. Each was a mark of trust, authority, and presence. Many bear the names of Akkadian officials, governors, and royal agents, proof of a system that reached far beyond its capital. And the tablets, thousands of them, bear witness to a world not of glory, but of detail: barley rations, sheep tallies, canal repairs, birth and death. In them, we see not only the state, but the people. A woman named Amma writes to the temple about a lost goat. A man named Ilampisha receives payment for stone cutting. A record of orphans receiving food from the temple appears in careful script. These are not legends. These are lives. Each artifact, each fragment, is a word in the language of memory. Together, they speak of an empire not only of conquest, but of complexity. An empire that measured, remembered, and ruled. One that believed power must be recorded, and that even the smallest task deserved a place in clay. And though Akkad's capital remains unfound, these scattered remains form a kind of ghost city, a scattered stele, a seal here, a tablet there. Enough to walk its streets in the mind. To see the past not whole, but still alive. Beneath the soil of Mesopotamia, the past sleeps lightly. Each season, as archaeologists return to the fields and telltale mounds of Iraq, they listen, not for voices, but for patterns. For fragments of walls, layers of ash, the curve of a broken tablet that says, "Here, once, a world existed." Among the great pursuits of Near Eastern archaeology, few are more tantalizing than the search for Akkad, the city itself. Despite centuries of study, its precise location remains a mystery. No ziggurat labeled Akkad has yet risen from the earth. No city gate bearing Sargon's name has emerged from beneath the sand. And yet, the evidence keeps building, clues scattered across administrative tablets, royal inscriptions, and patterns in trade routes. Scholars have proposed several likely areas, particularly north of Nippur, near the old flow of the Euphrates River. But the river has changed course since the 3rd millennium BCE. What was once riverside may now lie beneath farmland or towns, or under layers of silt deposited over thousands of years. Satellite imagery, drone surveys, and magnetometry have become new tools in the hunt. These technologies scan beneath the surface, revealing outlines of ancient buildings invisible to the eye. In some places, they've uncovered walls, streets, even potential archives. Yet no single excavation has confirmed the city of Akkad. But in the meantime, excavations elsewhere, at Gersu, Sitpar, Tel Leilan, and beyond, have uncovered new light on Akkad's reach. Recently unearthed archives have revealed administrative complexity that matches the descriptions of Akkadian bureaucracy, tax registers, personnel lists, temple accounts. Seals have appeared with the names of Akkadian kings and governors, scattered across lands from the Levant to the Persian Gulf. Each find is a thread in a tapestry slowly reweaving itself. And more than stone and clay, it is the questions that endure. What did the capital of the world's first empire look like? How did its people live? What songs did they sing at dusk? What became of them when the empire fell? Modern archaeology moves not with haste, but with care. It brushes gently, layer by layer, knowing that one stroke too deep may erase more than it reveals. In Akkad's case, it is not only buildings that are buried, but memory. Yet hope remains. One day, perhaps, a cylinder will be lifted from the earth. A seal will be turned in a scholar's hand. And the name will read not of a vassal or a satellite city, but of Akkad itself. Until then, the earth holds its secret. And we, above it, still listen. The story of Akkad is not just a tale of kings and cities. It is a mirror. In its rise, we see the birth of ambition, how a man from humble roots can reshape the world. In its structure, we witness the birth of governance, how empire is not sustained by war, but by order, by grain counted and voices recorded. And in its fall, we see the great silence, the moment when power, unguarded by humility, begins to fade. Empires have risen since then. Babylon, Assyria, Persia, Rome. Each bore echoes of Akkad. Each learned from its glory, and often repeated its errors. From Sargon, we learn the strength of vision, that leadership need not come from lineage, but from purpose. From Naram Sin, we learn the weight of pride, that the claim to divinity may lift a king, but it may also break him when the sky grows silent. From the scribes, we learn the quiet endurance of knowledge. Their tablets outlived palaces. Their lines of script became the bridge between centuries. And from the fall, we learn that even the most intricate systems, if too rigid, too proud, too dependent on fortune, will break when tested by time, drought, or the shifting mood of the divine. Yet perhaps the greatest lesson of Akkad is this: that memory matters. Because Akkad was remembered, through hymns, through curses, through names claimed long after its stones had crumbled, it shaped history not just once, but many times. It became a pattern, a precedent, a guide. Even in absence, it taught. In the echo of its stele, in the dust of its unwritten capital, Akkad still speaks. Not with commands now, but with reflection. It asks us to look not only at what was built, but why. Not only at how power is won, but how it is held. Not only at what endures, but what must be remembered to endure. Power fades, but story that can last forever. The sun that rose over Akkad in Sargon's day, bright with ambition, gold with conquest, did not fall in a single dusk. It dimmed slowly, veiled by drought, scattered by rebellion, shadowed by the passing of greatness. By the time the Gushans roamed freely through the plains, the once mighty empire was a memory wrapped in ruin. Its cities, fractured. Its roads, silent. Its kings, replaced by names that no longer echoed across horizons. But endings, in history, are seldom final. What faded was the body of Akkad, not its spirit. Its language lived on, carved into the clay of later empires. Its governance became the scaffolding for Babylon and Assyria. Its stories, Sargon's rise, Naram Sin's crown, the curse and the silence, were remembered, retold, reimagined. Even its failure taught. Future kings learned to respect the temples, to heed the gods, to fear the weight of divine silence. Others, braver or bolder, tried again to wear the horned crown, but none without hearing, in the deep chambers of their courts, the whisper of Akkad. And so, in its sunset, Akkad passed into something greater than power. It became legacy. It became the first chapter of a much longer story of how humans organize themselves, dream beyond their borders, and leave behind not only ruins, but records. Of how empires are not only remembered for how they ruled, but for how they are remembered. And that is where we find Akkad now, not in walls or statues, but in thought. In the way we name, govern, measure, and record. In the quiet reverence of those who still read the wedge-shaped signs pressed into clay by hands long turned to dust. So let the final light of Akkad be not an end, but a reflection. A flicker in history's long dusk, reminding us that from silence can rise the first empire, and from its fall, 1,000 beginnings.